The morning the Runt pigs arrived, it was a Tuesday in the second week of October, 1987, and the fog had settled so low over the south field that you could not see the fence line from the barn door. Not the low, thin fog that burns off by 8 o'clock, the other kind. The kind that sits in the hollows and breathes, the kind my father used to say meant the ground was warmer than the air, that something underneath was still working, still alive, even as everything above was making preparations to quit for the year. The plum rows along the south fence were already bare. They had been bare since the third week of September, which was 2 weeks earlier than they should have been, and I had not yet decided what I was going to do about that. I had been farming that ground for 19 years at that point, had watched those trees put out blossoms every April without fail, had taken fruit off them in good years and in lean ones, and that September, watching the leaves go early and the bark start to look the way bark looks when a tree has made a private decision you were not consulted about. I felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with temperature. 41 trees in 2 rows, planted by my grandfather in 1931, running east to west along the bottom fence, and by the end of that September, 37 of them had put down their leaves like a man setting something heavy on a table and deciding he is finished carrying it. I told my wife that evening. She listened the way she listens, which is without interrupting, and then she asked how many acres we were talking about. I told her it was a little under 3 acres when you counted the headlands. She nodded once and went back to what she was doing. That was Vera. She never wasted a word on a problem until she knew the dimensions of it, and once she knew them, she was already most of the way to a decision. I was the one who stood at the barn door in the fog and felt things. She was the one who asked how many acres. I want to be honest about that. The pigs came on a flatbed out of a farm 2 counties east, a man named Deller, who raised a line of mixed heritage hogs that ran heavier than average and had a reputation for rooting, which is a polite word for destruction when you are talking about a neighbor's field, and a more interesting word when you are talking about your own. Deller had 45 runts from the fall farrowings, animals that had been pushed off the teat early and grown slow, averaging maybe 38 pounds apiece when a pig that age ought to have been running 60 to 65. They were not sick. They were not injured. They were simply the ones that had not gotten what they needed at the moment they needed it. And in a commercial operation, there is not much patience for that kind of animal. He had priced them at $4 a head, which even in 1987 was the kind of number that means a man is solving a problem rather than conducting commerce. I had my truck and a borrowed stock trailer at his place before he had a chance to reconsider. My neighbor, Dale Prewitt, watched me back that trailer up to the Deller loading chute from across the county road, and he idled there in his truck, which was cleaner than a farm truck has any right to be, and he rolled the window down and asked me what I was doing with 45 runts going into winter. I told him I was farming. He looked at the pigs, which were not impressive animals, and he looked at me and he said, in the way he had of being polite when he thought you were making a mistake, that he supposed I knew my own business. Then he rolled the window up and drove on. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. I heard later it had become 60 pigs, and that I had paid nothing for them because nobody would take them. The 60 was wrong. The nothing was close enough to true that I did not bother correcting it. What I had not told Dale, and what I had not told anyone except Vera, was that the pigs were not the experiment. The plum rows were the experiment. Or more precisely, the question I was trying to answer was whether what my father had written down in the last 2 years of his life, in the marbled composition book I had found in a coffee can on the second shelf of the equipment shed the winter after he died, was something he had actually proven or something he had only suspected. Because there is a difference, and my father was careful about that distinction. He was a man who wrote things down the way other men keep accounts, not to remember them, but to make them real, to hold them still long enough to look at. He had farmed that same ground from 1949 until the spring of 1984, when his heart made the decision his body accepted, And in 35 years he had filled 4 of those composition books, and I had read 3 of them over the years without feeling like I was reading anything more than a careful man's farm diary, acreage and weather, and what he paid for seed and what the co-op gave him back. But the 4th book, the one in the coffee can, was different. It was not a diary. It was more like a record of an argument he was having with himself, or maybe with the ground. And on page 41 of that book, in the penciled hand that got smaller and closer together in his last years, as if he were trying to fit more in before the space ran out, he had written something I had read a dozen times and not known what to do with. I did not know what to do with it because I was not sure I believed it, and I was not sure I believed it because I had not yet looked closely enough at the ground beneath those plum trees to know if he was right. I put the book back in the coffee can each time, because I was not ready. That is the plain truth, and I will own it. I had been not ready for 3 years by the time those pigs came off Deller's truck in the 2nd week of October, 1987. 3 years of picking up the coffee can and setting it down again. 3 years of watching those plum rows and not asking the question my father had asked, or not asking it in the way that required an answer. But that September, watching 37 of those 41 trees drop their leaves the wrong way at the wrong time, I understood that not asking was itself an answer, and it was not the one I wanted. So the night before Deller's flatbed came, I went out to the equipment shed with a flashlight and took that composition book out of the coffee can and read the page again, standing there in the cold with my breath coming out in small clouds. The line was still there. It had not changed. My father had written, "The root zone under the West Plum Row is exhausted, not depleted," which is a word farmers use all the time for ground that has given until it has less to give. Exhausted, like a person. And below that, in a slightly darker pencil, as if he had come back to it, he had written, "Organic load at depth may be the issue more than the surface. Pigs could do what the plow cannot." Then a question mark. And then in the margin, in letters smaller than the rest, "Never tried." Those 2 words, "never tried," were the reason I had put the book down every time before. Because they meant he did not know. He suspected. He had watched and thought and arrived at the edge of the answer, and then he had died before he crossed it. And he had left the question mark for whoever came after. I had come after. And I had been letting it sit in a coffee can for 3 years. I want to tell you what he meant, because it is not obvious, unless you have worked ground that has been planted to the same stock for 50 years without a serious rotation. A plum tree's root system runs shallow and wide, and in a row, planting on the kind of clay-based glacial, till we had along that south fence, the trees pull certain things out of the top 18 inches of soil across a radius of maybe 8 feet in every direction. They pull them year after year, and on flat ground without significant water movement, those compounds do not replenish at the rate the trees are drawing them. The extension agent who came out to look at the early leaf drop, a young man named Forsyth with a clipboard and a soil report from a sample he had taken in about 4 minutes, with a push probe, told me the trees were showing signs of what he called root competition stress, and that the most likely intervention was deep tillage with an incorporated amendment, probably a broadcast lime application given the pH he had measured. He gave me a number, said the ground was sitting at about 5.9, and that a lime incorporation to 6.4 or 5 would likely address the issue in 12 to 18 months. He was reading from a column on his clipboard when he said it. He was not unpleasant. He was 26 years old, and he believed in his columns. I thanked him, and I did not tell him about the composition book, because there was nothing in the composition book that would have made sense to him in the form it was in, which was a dead farmer's hunch with a question mark after it. What I believed, or what I was beginning to allow myself to believe, was that Forsyth's pH number was measuring the wrong thing, or rather, the right thing at the wrong depth. My father had written organic load at depth, not surface, at depth, and what Forsyth had done was take a push probe to about 7 inches and read what the top of the soil had to say. What was happening at 14 inches, or 18, or 22, where those lateral roots had been working for 56 years, was something the push probe had not been asked about. This is where the pigs come in. I penned all 45 of them in the 2 plum rows on the 14th of October. I built the fence myself out of cattle panel and steel T-posts, running it tight around both rows with a corridor between them, about 170 feet long and 30 feet wide at the widest point. I put a water line in from the barn. I spread ear corn in the panels to keep them working, and I threw in windfall apples from the old tree by the machine shed, because a pig that is eating and rooting is not a pig that is standing still and deciding to be unhappy. What I wanted was what a pig does naturally, which is use its nose and its front feet to break up and turn the soil in a way that a disc or a chisel plow cannot replicate, because a pig does not go to a set depth and quit. A pig goes to where the smell is. It follows something. It is not working to a specification. It is working to an instinct that is, when you think about it, a good deal older and more refined than anything that comes off a clipboard. Those 38-pound runts, thin as they were, had noses that worked. Within 4 hours of going into that pen, they had started in on the strip of ground between the tree rows, and by the following morning they had turned the first 20 feet of it to a depth that surprised me. Not the surface, not 6 inches. Some of them were working down to a foot or better in places where the smell was stronger, and I watched that and I thought, they know something Forsyth's probe didn't reach. I did not say this to anyone, but I thought it, standing there in the early light with the fog still sitting in the low places, and I felt my father's question mark beginning to shift in a direction. By the end of October, those pigs had worked their way down the full length of both rows twice over. I was supplementing them with corn and with kitchen scraps and a barrel of spent mash I got from a man who kept a small still operation up on the ridge, which is a detail I include only because the mash seems to have made them enthusiastic in a way that plain corn did not, and enthusiasm in a rooting pig translates directly into depth and thoroughness. The ground they left behind them was not just turned. It was inoculated, if that is not too strong a word, with what 45 animals produce over 6 weeks of concentrated activity in a space 3 acres and under. My father had written that the organic load at depth may be the issue, and what I was doing, following a thread he had left for me, was attempting to address that load from below rather than from above, using something that moved and breathed and followed its instinct down to where the problem actually lived. The November rains came on the 3rd of the month that year, a hard 2-day rain that would have turned a tilled field to mud, and the plum rows held their structure better than I expected. The pigs had done something to the texture of the ground that the rain did not undo. I took notes in my own composition book, a newer one, and I used his words where I could because they were more precise than mine. I wrote organic load at depth, addressed, question answered, November 1987. Then I moved the pigs out to the winter lot, fed them through the cold months on corn and hay and the occasional bucket of scraps, and I waited for April. There is no shortcut in this kind of farming. That is not a complaint, it is just a fact, the way the distance between 2 fence posts is a fact. You can wish the posts were closer and the fence would still be the same length. I am a man who has put a lot of fence in, and I know that you do not save time by deciding to believe the distance is shorter than it is. You just end up with a fence that does not reach. So I waited. I did what I normally do in winter, which is maintain and repair and read and think too much in the evenings, and I kept checking those plum rows every few days when the ground was not frozen solid, walking the rows and looking at the bark and looking at the bud sites on the branches, because a fruit tree will tell you in February, if you know how to look, whether it has decided to come back or not. The buds are small and tight in February, about the size of a kernel of dried corn, and a healthy bud has a particular color to it, a red green that looks almost bruised, and a bud that has decided it is done for that tree is a different shade entirely, something closer to the color of old wood, dry and finished looking. I walked those rows in February, and I counted. Out of 41 trees, 33 had buds that looked alive to me. That was up from 4, which was the number I had counted the previous February, with a feeling I did not enjoy. 33 out of 41. I wrote it down. March was cold and dry and mostly unremarkable, and I will tell you honestly that I second-guessed myself more in March of 1988 than I had in any of the months before it. This is the nature of a long bet. When you are still in the middle of it and the evidence has not yet arrived, the mind goes back and looks for the reasons it might be wrong, and finds them readily enough, because doubt is never short of material. I thought about Forsyth's pH number and wondered if I had been arrogant. I thought about the 45 pigs and what they had cost to winter, which was not nothing. And I thought about what Dale Prewitt would say if April came and those trees stayed bare, which was that he would not say much, because Dale was not a cruel man, but that his silence would be a kind of verdict. I did not tell Vera what I was feeling in March. She knew anyway, she always did. She came out to the barn one evening while I was going over the winter feed receipts, and she stood in the door for a moment, and then she said, out of nowhere, that the buds on the plum rose looked different than they had in February. I asked her different how. She said darker, more of that bruised color. I put down the receipts and went out with a flashlight, which was probably more urgency than I should have shown, but Vera had sharp eyes, and she was not in the habit of telling me things she was not sure of. She was right. The buds had swelled and darkened in the 2 weeks since I had checked them, and I stood there in the dark with my flashlight moving from tree to tree, and I counted again, 33, then 35. Then I went back and looked more carefully at 2 trees I had written off in February, and one of them had buds I had not read correctly in the cold. 36 trees, 2 rows, and the April question had not yet been asked. April asked it on the 9th, which was a Saturday, though I wish it had been a Tuesday for the sake of a cleaner story. The temperature that morning was 41 degrees, and the sky was the color of old tin, the flat gray that does not commit to anything, and I was at the south fence by 6:15. I have thought about how to describe what those plum rows looked like that morning, and I keep arriving at the same word, which is white. Not the white of snow, not a blank white, the white of something alive. 34 of the 36 trees I had counted in March had come into blossom within about 4 days of each other, which in a row planting of trees that had been struggling for years is not a thing you expect to see. A stressed tree blooms late and thin. A tree that has given up does not bloom at all. What I was looking at was neither of those things. It was a row of trees that had decided apparently all at once that they had something to say again. 2 rows of them, 170 feet of them, in the kind of white that you do not forget if you have been waiting for it through a cold March and a doubting winter. I did not call anyone. I just stood there at the fence for a while. I remember the fog was in the low places again, the same kind of fog as that first morning in October, and the blossoms were above the fog line, and it was the kind of sight that makes you feel that your father knew what he was doing after all, even when he was only guessing. Especially when he was only guessing. The guess was still a form of knowledge. It was knowledge that had not yet been tested. I had tested it. I called a man named Archibald Seal that week, who ran a small agricultural extension laboratory out of a converted dairy barn about 40 miles north of us. He was not a young man with a clipboard. He was in his 60s, had spent 30 years doing soil work, and had a particular interest in what he called biological tilth, which is the quality of soil structure that comes from biological activity rather than mechanical intervention. I had met him once at a field day 7 or 8 years earlier and had found him worth listening to, which is not always the case with people who have a lot of letters after their name. I told him what I had done, plainly and without embellishment. 45 pigs, 6 weeks, 2 plum rows, October and November of 1987, and 34 trees in bloom that April, where I had counted 4 viable buds the February before. He was quiet for longer than felt comfortable, and then he asked me what depth the pigs had worked to in the areas of most concentrated activity. I told him I had observed them working to 12 to 14 inches in the sections they returned to most often, and to 8 or 9 in the sections they covered more quickly. He was quiet again. Then he said he would like to come and take some cores. He drove out on a Thursday in the 3rd week of April, a compact man with a canvas jacket and a soil probe that was longer than anything Forsyth had brought, and he spent about 3 hours in those plum rows without saying much to me. He took cores at 4 depths in 7 locations. He bagged and labeled them with the careful attention of a man who has done the same thing for 30 years and still believes it matters. When he was done, he stood at the fence for a moment with his jacket open and his hands on the top rail, and he looked at those blooming trees in a way that I recognized, which was the way you look at something when you are revising an assumption. I asked him what he thought. He looked at the rows for another moment, and then he said, "Substantial," just that word. I said, "Substantial in what sense?" He said, "In the sense that whatever those pigs found down there, they found enough of it to make a difference a plow would not have made." Then he shook my hand and put his equipment in his truck and drove back up the county road, and I stood at the fence for a while longer, looking at the white trees. The laboratory results from Archibald Seal's cores came back in the middle of May, and I want to give you the number that mattered most, because my father would have wanted the number. He was a man who trusted numbers when they were honestly arrived at. The organic matter concentration in the 12 to 18-inch zone under the West Plum row, which was the row where the pigs had spent the most time and returned to most consistently, was measured at 4.8%. The same measurement in an untouched comparison zone I had asked Seal to core from the fence row 40 yards east, same soil type, similar history, was 1.1%. The top 6 inches of both zones were within normal range of each other, which is what Forsyth's push probe had been reading all along. What Forsyth had not known to look for, and what my father had suspected with a question mark and the words never tried, was that the issue lived below the layer any standard protocol was designed to examine. The organic load at depth was the issue. My father had written it with a question mark in the last book of a life spent paying attention to the same piece of ground. I had answered it with 45 38-pound pigs and 6 weeks in October. Seal wrote me a brief letter with the results, and at the bottom, in handwriting that was smaller and neater than the rest, he had added, "The application was unconventional, but the result is not inconsistent with what we would expect from biological restoration of a depleted subsoil horizon." I read that sentence several times. I thought my father would have been pleased with it. I thought he would also have found it amusing that it took a man with a Ph.D. and a long probe to confirm what a mixed heritage hog already knew by smell. Dale Prewitt came by the place on a Thursday in the last week of May, which is early enough in the summer that the blossoms were past but the leaves were full, and the trees had the particular dense green of stock that is drawing well from the soil below it. He pulled up to the gate in the clean truck and rolled the window down and looked at the rows for a moment without saying anything. I was near the fence checking the wire on the bottom panel, and I looked up and waited. He looked at the trees, and then he looked at me, and he said, after a pause that had some weather in it, that they looked better than they had in a while. I said they did. He looked at them for a moment more, and then he said he supposed those pigs had done some good down there. I said I suppose they had. He nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he's revising something internally and does not particularly want to announce it, and then he rolled the window up and went on down the road. I watched his truck go, and I thought that was about as much as the situation required from either of us. Some vindicating moments are large, and some are the size of one nod from a man in a clean truck on a county road in late May. That one was the second kind, and it was enough. The pigs themselves, I want to account for them honestly because they deserve it. I had wintered all 45 of them and lost 2 to a respiratory problem in January, which left me 43 going into spring. By the following October, when I brought them to a small processor named Hatfield, who ran a USDA-inspected facility out of a converted machine shed about 22 miles south, they had grown into something that surprised even me. The runts had run. In 12 months on good corn and forage, and the particular kind of activity that keeps a pig lean and functional, they averaged 214 pounds live weight. 2 of the biggest topped 240. Hatfield walked through them in the holding pen and did not say anything for a minute or 2. Then he told me, in the flat voice of a man who deals in animals every day and is therefore careful about enthusiasm, that he had not seen that kind of uniform marbling on a mixed heritage group in a good while. I asked him what he thought they would dress out at. He said he would rather see it than estimate it. They dressed out at between 71 and 73%, which for a non-commercial heritage cross animal is a number worth saying twice. Hatfield processed them over 2 days and called me in the evening of the second day and said simply, "Exceptional." That was the word. The same kind of word Seal had given me at the fence in April. One word, chosen carefully from a man who did not waste them. I did not need more than that. There is a line my father wrote in the second of his 4 composition books, not the last one but the second, which he wrote in 1961 or thereabouts, based on the entries around it. The line is, "The field doesn't care who believes in it." I have read that line 100 times over the years, and each time it means something slightly different depending on what I am dealing with at the moment. When I first read it as a young man, I thought it was a statement about stubbornness, about the fact that the ground will do what it does, regardless of your feelings about it. Later, I thought it was about faith, or the lack of a need for it, the idea that the land operates according to its own arithmetic, whether you trust it or not. But in the spring of 1988, standing at the south fence watching those plum trees hold their leaves well into October for the first time in 4 years, I understood it as a statement about patience. The field does not need your belief, it needs your attention. It needs you to look at it long enough and carefully enough to ask the question that is actually there, not the question that is convenient, not the question that fits on a clipboard column. My father had asked the right question and had not lived to answer it. I had borrowed his question, which is what sons do with what fathers leave behind, and I had taken 3 years longer than I should have to try it. I put the notebook back in the coffee can each time, because I wasn't ready. That is the only part I regret, the 3 years. Not the pigs, not the cost, not the February doubt, or the March second guessing. Just the 3 years the trees stood there with the question underneath them, and I knew the question was there, and I was not ready. I am telling you this because I think there is something in it that is not particular to plum trees or pigs or a piece of glacial till along a south fence in the second week of October. I think it is something about the distance between suspecting and trying, and about what it costs to let that distance stay open longer than it should. My father closed the distance on a great many things in his life, and on one thing he did not. And he was honest enough about it to write ? And never tried in a coffee can for someone else to find. I found it. I was slow about it, but I found it. The trees are still in those rows. They are older now, and 2 of them have finally come out, which is what trees do, but 31 of them are still standing, and in April they are still white. And in a good year, I take fruit off them that tastes the way the variety is supposed to taste, which is to say, better than anything you will find in a market. And that is not sentiment. That is the honest result of the ground being right, at the depth where it matters. If you have got something like this, a piece of ground that has been asking a question you have not answered yet, an old notebook with a question mark in it, something your father or grandfather suspected and wrote down and left for you, and you have been putting back in the coffee can because you are not quite ready, I would ask you to consider the cost of the 3 years. Not the money, not the experiment, not the risk of being wrong. The cost of the 3 years. That is the part that stays with me. That is the part I would go back and change if there were a way to change it, which there is not. And the field, as my father wrote, does not care who believes in it. It only asks that you show up and do the arithmetic and follow the question down to where the answer actually lives. That is all any piece of ground has ever asked of any of us. If you have got a story like that, your own version of the question mark in the coffee can, I would genuinely like to hear it in the comments. Leave it there. Share it with someone who farms slowly and thinks too much in the evenings. And if this meant something to you, subscribe, because we move slow on this channel, but we get there.